I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight to our Payette Water System Secondary Water Supply Class EA Public Information Center. Before I welcome our consultant to the podium to complete the presentation, just like to thank J.L. Richards for the work they've done so far to date in the project, and all the work and consultation that staff have put into the project up until this point. So I'll invite Jane Wilson, our project engineer from J.L. Richards, to present an overview, presentation of the project that's been completed to date, and along with the alternatives that are going to be presented as part of the project. So Jane, I'll bring you up to the podium.
Thanks, Brian. Oh, that was so quick. All right. So as Brian said, my name is Jane Wilson, and I'm the senior environmental engineer on this project. I'm with J.L. Richards and Associates Limited. And tonight I will be talking about the town's secondary water supply Class EA. We're at the stage in the project where we've identified a preliminary preferred alternative. And the purpose really of tonight is to present to you how we've gotten to this point, and get any feedback from you might have on the evaluation or the recommendation that we're making. You can go to the next slide. That's okay. All right, so this slide shows the agenda, and really my intention here tonight is to walk you through the project from the very beginning to where we are now, which is the preliminary preferred alternative. There is a lot of content, and I know we're just a few people here tonight. So if there is something that's not clear on a slide as I go through, I don't know if this is allowed, but I'm welcoming questions throughout. If you have something more general at the end, we will have a formal question and answer period. We'll also stay after as long as people would like to talk about the boards and anything that we've presented here tonight. So before I get into the specifics of the project, I'll talk briefly about the municipal class environmental assessment process. So this is the framework that we followed to complete this study. Municipalities, anytime they're undertaking significant water or wastewater work, need to consider the potential impacts to the environment, the social community, technical considerations, and also economic considerations. And this framework is a way that we do that. Depending on the complexity of the project, a number of different phases need to be followed. For something like a new groundwater supply well, the first two phases of the framework are followed. So tonight I'll go through phase one, which is identifying the problem and opportunity, and phase two, which is looking at the alternative solutions and ultimately selecting a preferred option. And as Brian said at the beginning, stakeholder consultation is a key component of this process throughout. So I welcome lots of comments at the end of tonight. Right now in the town of Penetanguishene, all of the water is from groundwater. The town's supply well is called the Payette well supply system. You can see it in this figure. It's located sort of halfway between Penetanguishene Harbor and St. Andrews Lake. There are 3 wells at that site. The town also has another well supply system, the Robert Street well supply. There are 2 wells there, and they've been offline since the 1980s because of trichloroethylene contamination. All right, so the main purpose of this study is to look at the security of the town's water supply and also the redundancy of the town's water supply, and looking at those 2 challenges both in the context of today's needs and also future needs. You go to the next slide. So looking first at security of supply, these 2 figures show the town's wellfield protection areas. If you look at the one for the Payette well supply, you can see this area in orange. That's the area where there's a 2-year time of travel to the well. The area in dark green, there's a 2 to 10-year time of travel to the well. And then that area further out in the light green, there's a 10 to 25-year time of travel to the well. And you can see in this figure the town's industrial area, which is shown in blue, and it overlays that capture zone within 2 to 25 years. And so what this means that if there were to be an incident in the industrial area and contamination released into the groundwater, it would be within the 2 to 10 year capture zone of the well. And so the well is not experiencing any contamination issues right now. It's regularly monitored both at the well and between the industrial area and the well. But there is the potential for contamination that could reach the well relatively quickly. The other figure on this sheet shows the Robert Street well field. You can see again the capture zones for the well. This well, like I mentioned, has not been in operation since the 1980s when it became contaminated. Go to the next slide. And so that was security. The next challenge that we're looking at is related to redundancy of the supply. So there are a number of different standards that can be considered when we're looking at municipal groundwater supply systems. The first, and it would be the minimum standard that applies, is the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks guidelines for drinking water systems. And under that guideline, the town's water system is required to be able to meet the maximum day demand within the community with all of the wells in service. Another standard that is periodically applied to municipal groundwater well systems is the 10 state standards. And the 10 states are actually 9 American states and the province of Ontario. And under that standard, a recommendation is that the water supply system be able to meet that maximum day demand with the largest producing well out of service. And then another standard that we're looking at, which is somewhat specific to Payette or the town's water supply system, or level of redundancy rather, is full redundancy of the well system. And so under this, if all of Payette were to become contaminated, to provide redundancy, a new supply well or another source of water would provide full maximum day capacity. So in addition to what's available now at that well supply. If you go to the next slide. And so as I said at the beginning, we're considering these challenges related to security and redundancy, not only for today, but into the future. And so the timeline or horizon that we looked at in this study was to 2041, so about 20 years. You can see here that the town's population is expected to increase over that time from just over 9,000 in 2018 to almost 12,000 in 2041. Employment growth would also occur during that period. And so if you go to the next slide, this figure shows the level of redundancy in the town's water supply system over the next 20 years. It goes back historically as well. The orange line at the top shows the capacity of the Payette well field when all of the wells are in operation. The straight line beneath that, the green line, shows the capacity of the well field if the largest well was out of service. And you can see that blue line that shows the maximum day demand for the community over time. And you can see it increases as the population increases. And what this shows is that with all of the wells in service, there's lots of supply for the existing community. But if there was an emergency situation where one well had to be taken offline, as you get into the future, there would be inadequate supply under that condition. The line's not shown on here, but if Payette did become contaminated and all of the wells were impacted, there would be no supply in the community. So clearly that blue line showing the maximum day demand would be higher than what would be available if there was a contamination issue at the Payette well field. And so if you go to the next slide, great. And so then to address these two issues related to security and redundancy, the overall purpose really of this study is to identify some alternatives and then pick a preliminary preferred one. And we went through a fairly systematic process to do that. The first is identifying all the possible options and conducting a screening, and then completing a detailed evaluation of those shortlisted options, which will lead us at the end of this presentation to the preliminary preferred option. So if you go to the next slide. So this table shows the long list of options that was initially considered. You can see here that there are a number of different types of capital projects identified, but also a variety of different redundancy scenarios considered. And so the one near the beginning would be increasing the capacity of the system to meet the 10 state standard. And so that was having adequate supply to meet maximum day demand with the largest well out of service. The next level of redundancy we looked at was providing average day redundancy for the Payette system. So in that alternative, if Payette had to be taken completely offline, the new supply would be able to meet average day demands, which would help sort of buy some time until a longer term solution could be implemented. And the last option is the one with the most redundancy, which is maximum day supply redundancy. And so in that option, if Payette had to be taken fully offline, the new supply would be able to meet maximum day demands. And so if you go to the next slide, initially in the screening, a few options were taken off the table for consideration. The first was increasing capacity at the Payette well field. And the reason this was removed because new wells, I see someone nodding in the audience. If new wells were brought online at the same location, they would still be susceptible to that contamination risk from the industrial area, which overlays the wellhead capture area. You go to the next slide. Two other options that were considered but not carried forward are constructing a new surface water treatment plant and connecting to a nearby existing surface water treatment plant. Looking first at connecting to a nearby surface water plant, the nearest plant is in Township of Tay. It's more than 20 kilometers away. So that would be a fairly significant infrastructure project. And even on that scenario, you would still require additional capacity at that plant. And then constructing a new surface water plant. I'll talk more about the hydrogeology later in the presentation. But there is adequate groundwater supply within the community to supply not only existing needs, but future needs to beyond 20 years, which was the horizon we looked at. And so because of the considerable operations and capital costs associated with switching to a surface water supply, that option hasn't been considered in this stage of the process. And so if you go to the next slide. And so once some of those options were removed, we were left with a short list of 5 potential options. I'll go through each of these in detail now. So if you want to go to the next slide. So the first option is to implement risk mitigation measures. And a lot of these measures are already in place. I mentioned monitoring for contamination at the Payette well field itself. There are also upstream monitoring wells that could detect contamination in advance of it entering the well field. There's also a source water protection plan in place, and the policies within that are already being implemented. And so this option does help to improve the security of the supply, but it doesn't change the location of the well and its proximity to the industrial area. And so this option was carried forward, but only in combination with some of the other options that I'll go through next. You could go to the next slide. So this next option is alternative B. And that is providing treatment at the Robert Street well field up to its current permit to take water limit. So there already is already approvals in place at that well field to pump up to 3,273 meters cubed per day. And so under this option, a new treatment building would be constructed to provide disinfection and also treatment for trichloroethylene. And the 2 existing wells would be rehabilitated and brought back online. If you go to the next slide. At this location, the current yield was the sort of 3,000 meters cubed per day I just mentioned. But based on some hydrogeological studies and modeling that were done as part of this project, it was identified that that well could peak increase to a capacity of over 6,000 to potentially 11,000 meters cubed per day. So there is potential at that site to produce more water than's currently permitted now. Which is a key advantage of that option. Again, if we're looking to beyond our needs now and into the future, there continues to be potential to increase that well supply and increase the yield that's provided there. And if you go to the next slide. So that's the key advantage. The key disadvantage is that site does have trichloroethylene contamination. Trichloroethylene is an industrial solvent that can get into the groundwater if improperly disposed of. There are potential health risks associated with it, which depend on the dose and the duration of your exposure. And there are guidelines set by the Ontario regulations for the maximum permitted amount of trichloroethylene in drinking water. And so that limit is 5 micrograms per liter. And that's been designed to protect human health for people who are drinking the water. TCE, the good news story is that TCE can be treated. And there are a variety of treatment technologies available to do that. I've listed a few here. Advanced oxidation, activated carbon, and air stripping are a few examples. We go to the next slide. And so now looking at what the TCE concentration or the trichloroethylene concentration is, has historically been at Robert Street. Sampling has been ongoing there since the 80s when it was taken offline. You can see this graph starts in the early 2000s, and you can see at that time the concentration was close to 50 micrograms per liter. Now in the most recent set of testing, which was done last year, the concentration is below 10 micrograms per liter. And so we would expect that the concentration of trichloroethylene would continue to decline there over time. You can see, though, that it could take a number of years before it passes that 5 microgram per liter limit in the Ontario Drinking Water Standard. And so if you go to the next slide, that means that treatment would be required for trichloroethylene at that site. And so, like I said, there are a number of technologies that are available. For this study, we looked at advanced oxidation, which can bring the limit of trichloroethylene down much below that 5 microgram per liter that's required by the Ontario Drinking Water Standard to 2 micrograms per liter and potentially lower. If you go to the next slide. And so just to sum up, alternative B, it would be bringing the Robert Street wells back online and providing both disinfection and treatment for trichloroethylene. The main advantage is that it would increase the security of supply. The town would no longer be reliant just on a single well field, the Payette well field. There would now be 2 well fields in operation. And additionally, providing that treatment for trichloroethylene would mean that the Robert Street well would be less susceptible to contamination impacts in the future. When you look at the treated effluent quality, there would be a measure of protection there. Additional protection. And the other advantage of this is that there is the potential for higher yield from that well. So this system could be expanded in the future, which would be particularly appealing as the concentration of TCE declines. The disadvantage is the operating costs associated with the trichloroethylene treatment. If you go to the next slide. So this next option is similar to alternative B, except instead of constructing that treatment facility to just over 3,000 meters cubed per day, it would be 6,500 meters cubed per day. And in this option, you would be providing nearly maximum day redundancy to the Payette system. The advantages and disadvantages are very similar to the previous option. It's really just a bigger system up front. So because of that, the capital cost would go up initially, but it does and it also requires some additional approvals to increase the drawing from the taking from that well. We go to the next option. The next option is to connect Penetanguishine's groundwater system with the town of Midland's groundwater system. In this option, a feeder main would be connected or constructed between the two systems, sort of north-south, and a booster pumping station constructed to convey flows in potentially both directions. In this option, each community would essentially act as a backup supply to the other. And about 3,000 meters cubed of water per day could potentially be transferred between those two systems. The main advantage of this option is that it does increase redundancy without constructing additional supply. The disadvantage, the flip side of that, is that no new supply has actually been created. So there's not additional water available within the system. It's just backup is there in case of an emergency. One of the disadvantages associated with this option are the operational complexities related to conveying water from one town to the other. Midland's primary supply wells are located in the southern part of Midland, and so water would have to be conveyed through their pressure zones to the northern part of Midland to connect to Penetanguishine's system. If you go to the next slide here, this just demonstrates the capacity of the combined system. The line in the middle in red shows the combined well supply for the two systems with the one largest well out of service. And the dashed line near the bottom shows the maximum day demand for the two communities. And you can see when the systems are combined, there would be adequate supply to meet that maximum day demand, even if the largest well was out of service. And so that is alternative D. The cost is about $7 million, so it's moderate in cost compared to some of the other alternatives. You go to the next one. So the next one is alternative E, which is constructing a new well field in Penetanguishine. For comparative purposes, we assumed it would be the same size as the current capacity of the Robert Street wells, so 3,273 meters cubed per day. The infrastructure required with this would be finding a location to construct the wells and potentially purchasing that land, constructing two new supply wells, and then building a treatment facility to provide disinfection. If you go to the next slide, similar to Robert Street, a study was conducted to look at the maximum potential capacity of wells if they were constructed in another location in town. We looked at two different locations. The first is the Point Street location, which is the one in the bottom in the circle near to the Robert Street well. And the other is in the West Harbor, which, as the name describes, is west of the harbor. And both of those locations have potential to provide higher yields than what's currently approved at Robert Street. So between 5,000 and 8,000 meters cubed per day, depending on where the actual location is. But you can see that the Robert Street potential yield would still be higher than either of those other two locations. If you go to the next slide. And so to sum up option E, the main advantage of this is that it may be possible to scale up in the future. The hope would also be to locate a well where there's not contamination, so treatment would only be provided to provide disinfection. There wouldn't be trichloroethylene treatment required. The disadvantage of this option is that it can be very challenging to site and actually construct a new high yield production well. There are no guarantees when you start to put holes into the ground that the yield will be as modeled. And then there is also still a risk of contamination of one of these wells, particularly in that Point Street location, whose capture zone would overlap with the Robert Street capture zone and could potentially pull in trichloroethylene as well. But this option doesn't allow for treatment of that, so it would have to be added after. You've already gone to the next slide. So on this slide, we've just summarized the capital and life cycle costs of each of the options. You can see implementing risk mitigation measures is the lowest cost, and constructing treatment at Robert up to that 6,500 meters cubed per day is the highest. The others fall sort of in between that. If you go to the next slide. And so a detailed evaluation was completed of all of these options. I'll highlight just a few of the criteria here. So the first is related to contamination risk. Option E, which was constructing a new supply well, scored poorly in that category, particularly if we looked at the Point Street location, because there could be potential of drawing in contaminants, but this system would not be originally designed to include treatment for it. The other is the long-term system capacity, and I talked about this as I went through, but the Robert Street options score the highest there, because it is the highest potential yield of all of the three options considered. You go to the next slide. And so ultimately, when this evaluation was complete, the two Robert Street options scored favorably. And then if you go to the next slide. And so ultimately, based on discussions to date, the preliminary recommendation is to proceed with alternative B, which is providing treatment at the Robert Street well field up to its current permit to take water limit. In the future, it could potentially be expanded beyond that. This alternative, the main advantage is that if the Payette well field had to be taken fully offline, it would provide average day capacity, which would enable some time to implement a longer term solution without pre-building a plant that's much larger than necessary, knowing that the Payette well field is still in operation and operating well. And like I said, the main advantage of this is that although the original plant would be constructed to just over 3,000 meters cubed per day, it could be expanded in the future to accommodate additional growth within the community, or to take up some of the need from Payette if Payette did become compromised. Total capital cost is just over $8 million. On the life cycle cost is around 12 million. You go to the next slide. And so this figure shows the redundancy in the system if this solution were to be implemented. So that top line shows the total capacity of all the wells. That's the Payette and the two new wells at Robert Street if they were brought back online. The green line shows the capacity of the system if all of Payette had to be taken out of service. And then that yellow dash line shows the average day demand. So you can see under this scenario, if all of Payette had to be taken offline, the new Robert Street wells could meet average day demand. You can see that the blue dashed line is the maximum day demand. And so if Payette had to be taken off long-term, additional supply would be required. But under this scenario, there is at least an opportunity to meet average day demands until something could be implemented or the issue addressed at Payette. Overall, though, you can see that the capacity of the system is more than adequate to meet the maximum day demands, not just now, but well into the future. So that's that top purple line. If you go to the next slide. And so associated with the option to provide treatment at the Robert Street site, there are some environmental and archaeological considerations. The Robert Street well site is located near an evaluated and an unevaluated wetland. So to mitigate potential risks associated with developing there, we've recommended that the work take place further to the west, away from those sensitive areas. The building itself that is on site, we're not proposing to do anything to that building. A new treatment building would be constructed to the west. But if it was found during detailed design that modifications were required to that building, it looks like it celebrated its 100th birthday last year. So it might have cultural heritage potential. And a study would need to be undertaken there to confirm any mitigation measures that would be required if modifications were required to that building. If you go to the next slide. That brings me to the end of the presentation. I want to just highlight again that the class environmental assessment process is designed to allow for lots of opportunities for stakeholder input. I'm happy to do, there'll be a Q&A after this. I'm happy to stay as long as I need to answer questions tonight. There are also comment forms at the back of the room. And for people watching online, you can submit comments by email to me or Brian. Our contact information is on the website. And so with that, you can go to the last slide. And I will thank everyone for coming tonight, and we can turn it over to question and answers. Yeah, I think you have to come up to the mic. Sure, I can. Sure. Yeah, so the question was there an artesian well at the Robert Street location? And yes, one of those wells is artesian, and it would continue to be artesian. We've planned for treatment of it that way.
A well on Fox Street.
Yeah, and so those wells are still there. Mo, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one that continues to be monitored annually. Not that one.
Mo, did you have your microphone on? So the question was, there was a question about the presence of wells on Fox Street by Beck Boulevard. And whether they're still in existence.
Okay, they were, it was still in service up till about 10 years ago. And then I started seeing something that disturbed me a little bit. I saw that every time we had a little bit more of a rain event, I would see the increase in water flow out of that well. So I don't believe, Paul, you may recall if we ever did a goodie on that. We never touched that Fox Street well. So I wasn't sure if there was a groundwater under direct influence of surface water in that respect. So we capped it off, and we haven't been testing it for quite some time now because nobody's been taking any water. There was never anything wrong with the water. It's just my own personal feelings about it were, I thought it'd be best just to close it off to the public. So that's what happened with that well. But it's most of that water would come directly from the same aquifer that we supply the entire town of Pentank with. So that's all out of the Payette Drive aquifer.
Great. Are there other questions?
Wouldn't it be, couldn't you research that one? Like, it sounds like the water's there. There's water there.
Yeah, so certainly we did look at the option to construct the question was, could we use that well? And under the option to construct a new well, we left it fairly open-ended to where that well would be. One of the key criteria was though that it was outside of the capture zone of the Payette well field. So that's why the locations were picked further to the south and to the west, to get outside of the area that's already influenced by the Payette well field. But certainly if the decision was made to look for a new well location, consideration could be given to other sites than the two that were presented here tonight. Those were just the two that were most favorable because they were outside of the capture zone of the existing Payette system.
So is drought at all taken into consideration when you do these surveys? Like the weather is going to be hot?
Yeah.
Hotter than what we normally used to.
Yep. So there is a lot of work done to look at what the impact of drought would be on the water supply system. There are studies that have looked at that specifically, and there are no particular concerns with the current supply wells with respect to the impact of low rainfall events.
We do have, the question was regarding drought periods, and obviously the impact that would have on water taking in Penetanguishene. We do have our risk management official from Severn Sound Environmental Association. And the studies that Jane was referring to is I believe the Tier 3 water supply study, where I believe it was Golder that did the water modeling associated with that. Where they did simulate drought conditions, and there were no concerns raised during that modeling process. So we're well situated to withstand a drought period here in Penetanguishene. Unless you wanted to add anything else there, Melissa?
Ryan, would you be able to outline the process from here? Like tonight's an information meeting, no decisions being made, but if we go with any one of these options, what does that look like? What does engagement look like? What's kind of the time horizon and community engagement look like from here?
Thank you, Worship. So from here tonight, as Jane indicated, there's the option for people in the audience and those watching tonight. We also have the video from this meeting posted on our project website. So for those that couldn't make it tonight, they have the ability to see what was presented tonight. We'll take the comments that we get back, we'll incorporate them and respond to them as part of this process. And once that's completed, the preferred design or preferred option will be brought forward to council for consideration, accounting for all of the comments that have been received during the public comment period. And the project file report would be finalized with that public feedback incorporated within it and posted on our website and made available to the public for comment. And assuming there are no objections, part 2 orders being submitted from the public, the project and its preferred alternative would be approved. So as Jane has indicated, we're definitely encouraging people, those in council chambers tonight and those in the public to provide comments and engage in the process. And we're more than happy to respond to any comments that may come forward. Jane, did you want to add anything to that, or did I miss anything?
No, I think you covered everything there.
We do have, Councillor Vadabancourt, we do have Melissa Carruthers from the Severn Sound Environmental Association. I don't know if you want to raise your hand there, Melissa. So she has a lot of knowledge related to our source water protection plan. She's been involved in the process since the very early days. And we also have Paul DeWall from WSP Golder in the audience tonight, who's I don't want to date you, Paul, but you've got I think about 30 plus years experience with the wells in our area. So he's a great resource, and he's here tonight in case there's any specific questions related to any of those fields. And of course, we have Jeff Hamlin in the audience here tonight from Public Works, and also Mo Lefebvre, our chief water operator. So I encourage everyone to reach out and discuss what's been presented tonight, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Brian. My question had to do with with respect to the environmental assessment. Assuming that everything goes through and it's approved, how long is it valid for?
So you want me to?
Sure, Jane, go ahead.
Sure. So the Class EA would be valid for 10 years after the 30-day notice period closes. So if you were to issue it in the next couple of months, you would have 10 years after that to start implementation of the works.
Thank you.
So if there's no other questions, we can feel free to stay around and to speak to any of the staff members or consultants that we have here tonight. They'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.